kind introduction. Thanks to everyone for putting your drinks to one side. Well, you haven't got to put your drinks to one side. You can keep them with you while I take up just a few minutes of your time, and I won't take up too much of it. I have to say I feel a little bit like a fish out of water here. As you heard, my career has been very much in the public sector. I've never worked for anybody who's tried to make a profit out of anything. So when I'm asked to come and speak at a wealth management event, wealth management to me sounds like a very good idea in theory, but it's not something I've ever had the pleasure to try to put into practice myself. It reminds me of one of Spike Milligan's best lines, that I would like the opportunity to discover that money can't make you happy. So in terms of the business world, you guys and women know far more about it than I do. Politics is my profession. But one of the things I've liked about my career, which has been very varied, I have to say, is that it does throw me into situations like this, where you pinch yourself and think, what on earth am I doing here? For example, I mean, I'm going to drop a few names. I drop a few names in the book, which people tell me off about, but it can't be helped occasionally. Finding myself in a conference centre with Bill and Hillary Clinton, or, as I was on one occasion, closeted on my own in a room at a Labour Party conference with Nelson Mandela for 10 minutes. Those extraordinary things that come to you when you're least expecting them. And the opportunity to meet Narendra Modi was exactly one of those occasions. I studied politics at university, international relations. I knew a bit about India. I knew a bit about Indian democracy. I travelled there. I visited it a few times, but always as a tourist, never professionally. So when a call came out of the blue, which suggested that Prime Minister Modi, as he then was, wanted or thought it might be a good idea to have a book written by a Westerner about his election campaign, and might I perhaps be interested in being considered for that, it came as a shock and a surprise to me. I was told that he'd read one of my earlier books about working for Tony Blair, which I thought actually was a bit of sort of flattery and a bit of soft soap to try and get me interested. And then Manoj told me recently that actually it was absolutely true, and he had seen one of my books, although Manoj says he gave it to him. So, but that was a book about it was a bit of the sort of underbelly of politics, actually. I mean, it was some of the less glamorous business of being a prime minister and being at the top in politics. So why he thought that was a good advert for having me write about him, I don't know. But this was in July of last year. Modi had only been Prime Minister for a few weeks. And I had the opportunity to go out there and meet him, a bit of a get-to-know-you session, a bit of a sort of chit-chat, I was told it would be, so he could see whether he sort of liked the look of my jib, whether I was the sort of chap that he might like to spend some time with talking about his campaign. I mean, I know politicians well enough, and I've met enough of them to know what they're like, and they love talking about themselves. So one of the first things I learned was that Prime Minister Modi doesn't really do small talk. And beyond I mean, he's extremely polite and welcoming and very courteous indeed, and had plenty of time for me. But as soon as I asked the first question about the campaign, he was off, and he was telling stories of one sort or another, and all of them about this extraordinary campaign that he'd just fought, that he was still full of. And of course then he was already involved in state elections that were very important to him, and as we've seen, he's really been on the road ever since. He hasn't stopped since becoming Prime Minister. If he isn't travelling around the country fighting elections within India, and then he's travelling around the world selling India and being a superb ambassador for his vision of a new India, which is one of the things I've tried to talk about a little bit in the book. Now, the reason I was so excited to do it, I mean, he's not my stripe of politician in many ways. I come from the centre-left in politics. I worked for Tony Blair, as I said. He has no problem about being described as a right-wing nationalist politician. So you'd have thought that perhaps we wouldn't necessarily see eye to eye. And I think perhaps it's a credit to him that he was happy to have somebody like me come in and analyse his campaign and write about his campaign. And there are many things in politics that he and I would never agree about. But one thing that I think both love is elections. I'm thoroughly enjoying the general election that we are going through at the moment in the UK, and my mind's full of that. A fascinating election, a nail-biting election, a totally unpredictable election. And actually, quite an interesting election. I wrote a piece at the beginning, before the election properly started, and I was comparing the election in India with our own, and it looked to me at that stage as if ours was going to be a really, really dull campaign. Where both the main parties were they were sort of stuck in the ruts of previous campaigns that they'd fought before, and the Tories were saying, don't let Labour ruin it, the economy's on the right track, don't let Labour ruin it, and Labour was saying, don't let the Tories ruin the NHS, and that was it, and we were just going to sort of slog our way through to polling day. It's actually proven to be much, much more interesting than that, because it's such a closely fought election. And they are both panicking to differing degrees, because neither of them have managed to open up a lead over the other. So I think the next 10 days up until polling day are going to be absolutely gripping, but at least our campaign is relatively short. A lot of people think, oh God, I can't take any more of it, but it's only a few weeks, whereas the Indian election, as we know, went on for months. And as I tried to explain in the Modi effect, I believe that Narendra Modi's campaign to become Prime Minister went on for several years, that he was planning it, even though he wasn't prepared to admit it to many people, a long time before he was actually selected as the candidate for Prime Minister. Now, he was courteous enough and kind enough, even though he had an inbox that would make your eyes bulge, problems to deal with, to give me several hours of his time to talk about his campaign and his ideas and so on and so forth. And I was extremely grateful to him for that. Although again, I mentioned this in the book, he's a superb salesman for India. He's also a superb salesman for himself, and there's nothing wrong with that. I've never met a politician who isn't. They love to talk about themselves, and they have a long list of their achievements, which they can roll out at any moment without thinking twice about it. And there's no doubt that Narendra Modi is one of those. Occasionally he would try to do this sort of self-effacing bit. I'm a humble worker, and my fate is in the hands of the gods, and I really didn't mind whether I became Prime Minister or not. And it was one of those occasions when I felt like, oh, come off it, mate. I mean, please. I've been a spin doctor. I know spin when I see it. But he did it with a straight face, and he told me the story of the day on which the BJP were deciding who their candidate should be for Prime Minister, and he said that he was getting on with something else, and he really didn't pay any attention to it at all, and it was of no interest to him whether it was him or somebody else who actually got chosen for the job. And I did find that ever so slightly implausible. He must have been the only person interested in politics in India who wasn't on the edge of their seats wondering who was going to be selected to be the candidate. Having been selected, he then fought this extraordinary campaign. It really was an extraordinary campaign, with lessons, I think, for politicians all around the world in any kind of democracy. And I look at the campaign that we're fighting at the moment here in Britain, and I've been involved in fighting those campaigns myself. I was Director of Communications for the Labour Party in 2001 when Blair got his second big majority. And then, as now, we brought in outside consultants from America in our case, and Ed Miliband's done the same. David Cameron's brought in Linton Crosby from Australia, for better or worse, to try and turn him into a sort of true-blooded, red-blooded, blue-blooded Tory, and that doesn't seem to be working very well either. And I just sometimes wonder whether the gene pool of advisors in our elections is a little too narrow, and we may have things to learn elsewhere. And it was interesting that while this extraordinary campaign was going on in India, there were very, very few election observers from the West watching what was going on. Whereas when there's an election in America, everyone from London who's remotely involved in politics piles over there to take part, and vice versa. But apart from the Indian community, of course, both here and in the States, and the NRIs, who really did take a keen interest in what was going on, and some, like, of course, Manoj, actually took time off and made sure that they were there because they were aware that something really, really special was happening. I think the rest of us, who were picking up bits and pieces through the media, weren't aware of what an extraordinary event it was, really, until it was over. And when it was over, it struck me that there was definitely a market there for someone to go and try to understand it from a Western perspective, and explain what had happened to a wider audience. And I hope that's what the Modi effect seeks to do. But there are challenges involved in that. There are lots of similarities. The Indian political system, as you know, is modelled on ours in many ways. First past the post, 2 houses of parliament, all the rest of it, trying to get a majority. But the cultural background and everything else about it, the size of the country, the nature of the campaigning has to be very different. And on the first meeting I had with him, I was sitting in the waiting room and sort of making polite conversation with the civil servants who were there. And an astrologer walked in. I didn't know he was an astrologer until he told me, but he was in sort of white robes with the tilter and all the rest of it. And he started chatting, and I thought, this is a bit strange. He started giving predictions for everyone who was in the room. And he looked at me and said, "You'll achieve 3 great things in life." And it was a bit like sort of, what you get on the end of the pier in Brighton. I thought, I said, "Well, how do you know? You've never set eyes on me before." He said, "Oh, just from the way you're sitting and the way you're holding your hands, I can tell that you're going to be very successful in 3 different fields." Maybe one of them was making money eventually, but we'll have to see about that. So then, of course, I asked him about his predictions for Mr. Modi. He was going in to see Mr. Modi. I've no idea whether it was to talk about his prospects or whether it was about something else. But he told me that he thought that Modi would be in power until 2032, which is quite a long time. And that most of that time he'd have a short spell in opposition, a short spell in coalition, and the rest of the time he would have a majority. Which seemed very precise to me, so we'll see how accurate it was. And I sort of mentioned this to Modi during one of our conversations. That, it was unusual for me. I remember, you may too, when Cherie Blair was supposed to be cavorting, consorting, whatever the word is, with a woman who was into mystical practices and the way she was derided in the media. President Reagan, way back, going even further, was supposed to have consulted Nancy Reagan's astrologer, and this was seen to be extraordinary. But my Indian friends told me, actually, in India, that's not so surprising. People wouldn't be so surprised that there was an astrologer in the Prime Minister's waiting room. And when I had a conversation with Modi about it himself, he said, he told me a story about when he was first elected Chief Minister in Gujarat in 2001. And he met an astrologer, who he knew already, I think, and said to her, "Why didn't you tell me that I was going to become Chief Minister?" And she said, "Oh, because we see in your stars that you're going to be Prime Minister one day." And clearly he took that on board. I think he was prepared to allow the fates to carry him to where he is now. So we had this campaign, which I think, as I said, could teach us a few lessons in all sorts of ways, and you'll have to buy the book if you want to find out what all those ways are. There are copies out there. I'll be sitting there desperately hoping that 1 or 2 of you will come and buy a copy after we've had a few words. But I think his use of social media in a country like India, where the penetration of social media is much lower than it is in our democracies in the West, incredibly effective, much more imaginative than our politicians do. I get texts and WhatsApp messages and all the rest of it from the political parties, and I delete them as soon as they appear. I know that it's just going to be the same old propaganda. He allowed social media to do what social media does best, and he had some really enthusiastic volunteers who made the most of those opportunities. He also, and I was a spin doctor, I know how hard it is to get the traditional media, radio, television, the newspapers, to tell the story the way you want it told. And I think he was incredibly successful at that, partly by refusing to engage with them. If they wanted to write about it, they could write about his extraordinary rallies and what he said when he was on the stump giving his speeches, or they could write about what he was saying on social media. He didn't give any interviews, sit-down interviews in TV studios, which we're familiar with our political leaders doing all the time, until very, very late in the campaign, when actually, given it was a 9-stage voting process, most Indians had already voted. So he didn't play the media's game in the way that we're used to our politicians doing. And that's, I think, a lesson that perhaps our politicians could learn as well. But the most interesting thing was that he was willing to be controversial. He was willing to set his sights incredibly high, to have very high ambitions, both for himself, for his party, and for the country. And to make news almost every day over such a long campaign. He was interesting every single day of the campaign. And that, I think, is very refreshing, where we are so used to politicians who are afraid to say anything too controversial in case they offend somebody or lose a small part of the coalition that they're trying to put together in order to get elected. Now, he did set those ambitions very high, and he set expectations extraordinarily high. And now, of course, he has the task of trying to meet those expectations and to repay the trust that people have put in him. Now, people will have different views as to how successful he's been, whether he hit the ground running, whether he's been a bit too slow, whether the budgets have done enough. But there's no doubt that he has the determination to succeed. And the final chapter in the book is called The Indomitable Will, which is a quote from Mahatma Gandhi, who said that success comes from, above all, from having an indomitable will to succeed. And the one thing about Modi that I carried away from all my interactions with him is that he has this indomitable will to succeed. I don't think he considers failure an option any day of the week. And his working week is 7 days, 24/7. He's a full-time politician and a full-time Prime Minister. And he didn't put so much time and effort over many years into achieving the position of Prime Minister not to be a successful Prime Minister. That's not to say he'll succeed. The astrologers say he'll succeed. Most of the media say he won't, or will sort of raise questions about it, but that's what their job is as well. Everyone does their job in these fields. We'll have to see how successful he is. But the one thing about it is that he is going to be interesting. He's going to carry on being interesting every single day of the week, and I look forward to watching the rest of his career, having, over a fairly short period of time, watched how he got there. Now let's see how he manages to make the most of the job that he's doing.